Remember when school felt wild, weird, and totally normal until you realized half of it's now banned? Those school things shaped our days, from the way we learned to the way we got in trouble, and nobody questioned it. Looking back now, were we actually okay with all of that? You are not imagining it. Schools really used to let the principal hit kids with a wooden paddle. This was not a figure of speech or a rare punishment. It was standard. If you talked back, got into a fight, or even forgot your homework one too many times, you could be marched down the hallway, asked to bend over, and whop. That was your lesson for the day. Some of these paddles even had holes drilled into them, supposedly to increase speed. Others were carved with slogans like Board of Education, like it was some kind of joke. And it was not just principals doing it. Coaches, vice principals, even homeroom teachers were allowed to paddle students with little to no permission from parents. It was considered discipline. The thing is, a lot of kids just felt humiliated or afraid, not reformed. Over time, lawsuits and mental health studies pushed back. States started banning corporal punishment, and schools were forced to find new ways to deal with behavior. Today, hitting a student with a paddle is not just frowned upon, it is illegal in most places. But if you grew up in those earlier decades, you probably still remember the sound of it. The silence in the hallway, the held breath, the way it made everything just a little too real. Believe it or not, some schools in the past had actual smoking areas, not just for staff, but for students too. You would walk past the gym and see a fenced-off spot with ashtrays, a few benches, and maybe even a trash can overflowing with cigarette butts. And yes, this was on school property. If you were in high school and of smoking age, whatever that meant at the time, you could light up during lunch or between classes. Staff had their own designated corner too, usually near the parking lot or behind the cafeteria. Sometimes teachers and students would smoke within a few yards of each other. It sounds surreal now, but it was all part of the culture. Smoking was seen as a stress reliever, even something social. Schools tried to contain the habit instead of ban it. But by the 1990s, health warnings and anti-smoking campaigns gained ground. Laws changed. Suddenly, it was not just about being old enough. It was about protecting the health of every student on campus. Smoking areas disappeared. The only thing left was the faint smell of tobacco in your coat sleeve, and maybe the memory of lighting up with your best friend before algebra. A habit like that might have felt cool then, but now? It is hard to imagine anything less welcome at a school. Let's talk about the absolute battlefield that was dodgeball in gym class. You walked into the gym, they tossed out some red rubber balls, and it was every kid for themselves. No teams, no rules, just chaos. The balls? Hard. Like, leave a mark on your face hard. Getting hit was not just painful, it was personal. Kids would wind up like major league pitchers and aim for heads. There was no padding, no safety rules. No one stepped in when someone got hit square in the nose. And teachers just stood there, maybe sipping their coffee, acting like this was completely normal. You could get a concussion and still be told to walk it off. Eventually, enough parents complained. Enough kids left gym class with bruises and busted lips. Dodgeball became regulated. Softer foam balls replaced the rubber ones. Some schools banned the game altogether, but if you were there during its lawless golden age, you remember the sound that ball made when it connected, that echo, that chaos, and the one unspoken rule: do not turn your back because someone would take the shot. Yes, it actually happened. Teachers used to smoke during class, inside the building, at their desks, in front of students. There was no teacher's lounge break. They would just light up mid-lecture and keep going. Some of them even had ashtrays right on top of the grade book. The smoke would curl into the air while you tried to focus on long division or vocabulary words. It was like sitting in a low-budget jazz club, but with less music and more math. The worst part? No one even seemed to mind. It was just what adults did. And kids, who obviously could not smoke, sat there breathing in secondhand fumes. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, health officials started cracking down. Smoking was banned indoors. Teachers were told to take it outside. and slowly, the classroom ashtray became a relic of the past. Now, the idea of lighting a cigarette around children is unthinkable. But if you ever had to squint through a cloud of Marlboro smoke to see the chalkboard, you know this was real, and maybe a little horrifying. This one feels almost like a cartoon, but it was real. If you messed up in class, especially in earlier decades, teachers might march you to the front of the room, plop a tall, cone-shaped dunce cap on your head, and make you sit in the corner, in front of everyone. The cap usually had the word dunce written across it in big, bold letters, and the goal was not correction, it was humiliation. You were basically put on display as the class failure. For some kids, it only made things worse. They would act out more or stop trying entirely. Teachers thought it was a way to motivate, but it usually just created shame and resentment. Eventually, educators realized there were better ways to handle mistakes. The dunce cap was removed. So was the corner. And slowly, the practice faded into legend. Now, the only place you will see a dunce cap is in an old comic strip or a vintage photograph. But for the kids who had to wear it, it is not something they laugh about. It is something they never forgot. Here is something that would absolutely make the news today. Teachers throwing chalkboard erasers at students. And no, it was not a joke. If you were not paying attention or caught whispering too much, you could get an eraser flung right at your desk, sometimes at your head. And these were not soft foam blocks. They were solid felt and wood, caked in white chalk dust. Getting hit was not just embarrassing, it hurt. Some kids would duck instinctively when the teacher reached for the chalk. Others learned to sit still out of fear, not respect. It was not uncommon for dust to fly into someone's eyes, or for a student to be singled out just for looking bored. And while it was often played off as just a joke, it left more than just chalk marks behind. A lot of teachers saw it as a harmless way to keep order. Just a little nudge, they said. But kids were ducking like it was dodgeball round 2. Some teachers even prided themselves on their aim. By the 1990s, this kind of discipline started facing real consequences. Schools banned physical gestures like that, and teachers were expected to use their words, not their throwing arm. Today, even raising your voice too much can land you in a meeting with the principal. But if you grew up dodging flying erasers, you know those classrooms had their own kind of tension. And you probably still flinch when you hear chalk hit the wall. The edgiest kids in school wore their rebellion on their backpacks. You had razor blade keychains, spiked chains, studs, even full-on miniature weapons clipped to the zippers. It was fashion, sure, but also a little dangerous. The razor blades were often real. Dull or not, they were still metal and sharp. The spikes? Thick steel points that could scratch, stab, or tear fabric. Sometimes backpacks got caught on jackets or scraped lockers wide open. One wrong turn in the hallway and you could get poked just walking by. Kids bragged about how heavy and dangerous their gear looked. It was a form of armor, especially for anyone who felt out of place, and school staff usually looked the other way unless something bad happened. You could not sit too close to someone without risking an accidental poke. But in the 1980s and 1990s, this was cool. It was self-expression. It was how kids showed they were not like everyone else. But as school safety policies got stricter, and as more fights and injuries were reported, schools cracked down. These accessories were banned. Students were told to remove them or go home. Today, you can still find punk or goth-inspired gear, but it has to follow strict safety guidelines. The fashion survived, the hardware, not so much. And if you ever got scratched by someone's spiked backpack in the lunch line, you understand why. There was a time when walking into the school cafeteria meant facing a lineup of vending machines that looked like they came straight out of a candy commercial. Rows of chocolate bars, sour straws, bags of chips, and soda cans chilled just right, all waiting to be yours with a few quarters. It was every kid's dream. You could buy a full can of soda at 8 in the morning, pair it with a pack of gummy worms, and call it breakfast. And no one stopped you. These machines were placed in hallways, gyms, even right outside classrooms. Teachers used them. So did students. Some kids brought in rolls of quarters just for snack time. Others skipped lunch entirely and loaded up on sugar. It was not uncommon to see a kid crash by third period, groggy and glassy-eyed. The worst part? No one was tracking how much anyone ate. But over time, schools started noticing a rise in sugar crashes, hyperactivity, and mid-morning naps. Health experts stepped in. New guidelines were passed. Schools began replacing soda with juice, candy with granola bars. Eventually, many banned the machines entirely, or kept them off limits during school hours. Today's students still get snacks, but they are carefully approved and often kind of sad. If you ever bought a chocolate bar and soda as your lunch and called it a win, you lived in a golden and now banned era of school snacking. Recess in the past was not just unregulated, it was a full-blown injury waiting to happen. Picture this: a towering metal jungle gym, hot in the sun, slick in the rain, and what was underneath? Solid, unforgiving asphalt. No rubber mats, no wood chips, just pavement. You fell, you got scraped, or worse. These jungle gyms were built like they wanted to test your limits. Climb too high, miss a step, and you were doing a face-first dive into the blacktop. Teachers rarely noticed unless you were really crying. Some kids wore their scrapes like badges of honor. Others learned to jump down early just to avoid a worse fall. You could spot the daredevils by the bruises on their elbows, and once the bell rang, everyone scrambled off like nothing happened. Injuries were expected, even encouraged in some circles. But hey, you learned fast. Eventually, safety reports, lawsuits, and rising injuries pushed schools to rethink playground design. Jungle gyms were lowered, metal was replaced with plastic, and soft landing zones became mandatory. Asphalt was officially banned under play equipment. Today's playgrounds are safer. Maybe even too safe, some would say. But if you still have scars on your knees from falling off the monkey bars, you know exactly what kind of chaos we used to call fun. You never forget the day you walked into class and saw a glass tank with a live snake in it. Or worse, a tarantula. And this was not a science lab. This was your regular classroom. These class pets were meant to teach responsibility, biology, maybe even courage. But let's be real. They mostly taught kids how to freak each other out. The snake would shed in the corner, the tarantula would vanish into its little cave, and every now and then, one of them would get out. Chaos. Full panic mode. And who was responsible? Usually the teacher, sometimes the students. Eventually, school boards realized that venomous or aggressive animals had no place in an elementary school. Bans were passed, rules were written. Now, if a class has a pet at all, it is usually a hamster, a turtle, or maybe a fish. Harmless. Manageable. But if you went to school in the era of scaly or hairy surprises, you know just how much tension a single hiss or rustle could cause. There was a time when walking into biology class meant coming face-to-face with a tray full of dead frogs and a set of scalpels that barely passed for school equipment. You were not eased into it. You were handed a frog, a worksheet, and a pair of gloves, if your teacher remembered. This was not advanced science. This was middle school, and every student was expected to open up their slimy little amphibian and start poking around like a mini surgeon. The smell? Unforgettable. Formaldehyde lingered in the air for hours. And, let's be honest, half the class just used it as an excuse to gross people out. Frogs were flung across the table, guts were squished for fun, and there was always that one kid who pretended to eat the eyeball. Eventually, animal rights groups stepped in, health regulations tightened, and parents started asking why their 12-year-old came home smelling like a medical lab. Schools moved toward virtual dissections or plastic models. Some districts banned animal dissection altogether. Today's students still learn biology, but without slicing into actual frogs on a Tuesday morning. If you did it, you remember. The cold skin, the little pins, the weird thrill of it all. But mostly, you remember being absolutely certain that science class was not for the faint of heart. Ah yes, the giant metal guillotine that sat in the corner of every classroom. The paper cutter. It looked like a medieval torture device, and yet students were allowed, no, expected, to use it. Just lift the heavy steel blade, line up your paper, and slice. Easy, right? Except it was not just paper getting too close. Fingers, sleeves, homework, all at risk, and teachers would barely blink. You could walk up to the front, wield this heavy-duty blade, and nobody would say a word. No training, no supervision. Just pure, unsupervised slicing power. Some students used it responsibly. Others, not so much. And when accidents happened, they happened fast. Cuts, blood, trips to the nurse. Eventually, schools figured out this probably was not the best tool to let 10-year-olds operate solo. Newer models came with locking mechanisms, protective guards, and strict teacher-only use policies. Some schools removed them altogether. But if you remember the satisfying thunk of a clean cut, you also remember the underlying terror. What if someone's hand slipped? It was quiet danger, sitting right there between the printer and the hole punch. Raise your hand if you ever sat in a classroom with those weird, crumbly ceiling tiles, the ones that would flake off if someone upstairs stomped too hard. Yeah, those were probably asbestos. For decades, asbestos was used in schools to insulate buildings and reduce fire risk. It was in ceiling panels, insulation, floor tiles, you name it. The problem? Asbestos is extremely toxic when disturbed. Breathing in even tiny fibers can lead to serious health issues years later, but nobody knew that at the time. You could spend an entire semester directly under loose panels and no one thought twice. Some classrooms even had holes in the ceiling, with chunks hanging down like forgotten birthday decorations. The solution, back then? Cover it up with a poster. Eventually, as the health risks became public knowledge, school districts scrambled. Asbestos was removed, or more often, sealed in. Now, regulations require inspections, abatement plans, and total transparency. But if you went to school before all that, you probably breathed in more asbestos than you want to think about. And the worst part? It was hiding in plain sight, right above your head. Let's take a moment for the classic school desk. You know the one. Solid metal legs, fake wood top, chipped corners, and usually some dried gum underneath. But the real danger? The paint. Lead paint. For decades, schools used lead-based paint on lockers, walls, and yes, desks. It was cheap, it was durable, and no one realized it was toxic. Kids would sit for hours at these desks, tapping their pencils on them, resting their faces, even peeling paint off when they got bored. That meant lead dust, and that meant exposure. The same went for lockers. Painted in bright, shiny colors that slowly chipped and flaked with age, students would decorate them, slam them shut, scrape off names with coins, all while unknowingly breathing in or touching lead. Over time, the health risks became impossible to ignore. Lead poisoning can cause cognitive issues, mood swings, and long-term developmental problems. Once the truth came out, schools were forced to repaint or replace furniture completely. Lead paint was banned, and safety regulations were tightened across the board. But if you grew up before all that, chances are you spent years surrounded by it. You just thought it was old paint. Turns out, it was something a whole lot worse. It sounds fake, but it is true. Cigarette companies used to place ads in school yearbooks and sports programs. You would flip through pages of senior quotes and football team photos, and then boom, a full-page ad for a cigarette brand, right next to the cheerleading roster. These companies were targeting future customers early. They used cool fonts, edgy slogans, and models that looked like they belonged on the swim team. It worked. Kids saw smoking as not just normal, but aspirational. And school publications welcomed the ad money. No one thought twice. But as anti-smoking campaigns picked up and research proved just how harmful cigarettes were, the backlash came quickly. Laws changed, advertising to minors was banned, cigarette ads were removed from schools, magazines, and television. But if you were around during that era, you remember seeing cool brands right next to prom photos. It was jarring, even then. And now, it feels like something out of a dystopian time capsule. But it happened, and it shaped how a lot of kids saw smoking, not as dangerous, but as part of growing up. Science class in the past was like a mix of learning and low-level danger. You were handed a Bunsen burner, an actual open flame, and told to be careful. That was it. No goggles, no gloves, sometimes no supervision. You just lit a fire at your desk and hoped nothing exploded. The teacher would walk around holding a lighter, igniting each burner while students passed gas tubes and chemicals around like it was arts and crafts. Paper caught fire, sleeves got singed, and the smell? A burnt cocktail of mystery. There was a weird pride in making your flame blue or watching magnesium flash like a tiny lightning bolt. But it was risky. Eventually, new safety guidelines were introduced. Lab goggles became mandatory, fireproof gloves were issued, ventilation was improved. Today, students still do flame-based experiments, but only under strict conditions. And some schools swapped the real burners out for digital simulations. But if you were there in the old days, you remember how fast things could go sideways. One knock of the elbow, and your worksheet was ashes. Science felt real back then, because it kind of was. If you were sent to the school nurse in the past, chances are you had your temperature taken with a glass thermometer filled with actual mercury. And yes, it went right under your tongue. You had to sit perfectly still, trying not to bite down too hard while the nurse timed it with a wall clock. No beeping, no digital readout, just liquid metal slowly rising. It felt like magic. Until one broke. Mercury is toxic. A single drop can release fumes that linger and build up in the body over time. But back then, it was considered normal. Broken thermometers were cleaned up with paper towels or, if someone knew better, scooped into a plastic bag. Eventually, mercury was officially labeled hazardous, and schools had to remove all devices containing it. Digital thermometers took over, safer, faster, and far less shiny. But if you remember the weight of that cold glass stick in your mouth and the eerie silver line climbing higher, you were part of an era that mixed basic care with hidden risk. And somehow, we all survived it. If you ever saw your teacher dim the lights and wheel out a projector cart, you knew what was coming: the weekly film strip. It was supposed to be educational, but really, it was more like a break for the teacher and a power nap for half the class. The projector was loud. It clattered. It sparked. Sometimes it smelled like burning dust. The film would jam halfway through and melt in the machine, leaving behind a crispy square and a lot of confusion. And let's not forget the beeping sound. Every slide was advanced by a little beep that haunted your dreams. The film strips themselves were ancient. Faded images, outdated facts, and the occasional reel that was upside down. Still, it was better than a quiz. Eventually, technology moved on. Projectors became digital, then disappeared altogether. But those old machines? They were practically antiques while we were using them. If you remember watching a safety film about volcanoes while the projector made weird coughing sounds, you know exactly what kind of chaos we are talking about. If you ever helped a teacher load slides into a projector, chances are you came away with a minor burn. These machines ran hot. They were made of thick metal, powered by intense bulbs, and the vents never worked. Teachers would fumble with them mid-lesson while students sat waiting in a darkened room. If a slide got stuck, someone had to reach in, and that someone was often you. The slide trays were sharp, the bulbs were scalding, and no one thought to unplug anything first. Getting burned was just part of the deal. And teachers? They acted like you were being dramatic. You are fine, it is just a little heat. Eventually, safety caught up. Modern projectors ditched the trays and the lava lamp level temperature. Digital presentations took over. Now, everything is done with a remote and a screen. But if you still have a faint scar on your finger from helping Mrs. Collins show a geography lesson in 1986, then you know those machines were no joke. They taught us slides and how to flinch. In the past, some teachers had a habit of giving students nicknames, but not the nice kind. They would call you by your haircut, your height, your last mistake. Speedy if you were slow. Space Cadet if you daydreamed. Stinky, tiny, giant, or trouble. And once it stuck, it spread. Suddenly, everyone was calling you that. It was meant to be funny. Sometimes it was. Other times, it cut deep. And if you tried to push back, you were told to lighten up. Today, we know how damaging that kind of labeling can be. Schools focus on positive reinforcement and emotional safety. Teachers are trained to avoid personal remarks, but if you went to school in those earlier decades, you remember the sting of hearing a room full of kids laugh at something a grown adult started. The names might have faded, but the feeling? That hangs around. If you ever had gym class during the warmer months, you probably remember the moment your sneakers came off and your feet hit what felt like lava. School gym floors, especially the ones with old vinyl or blacktop-style surfaces, got hot. Like fry an egg on it hot. And yet, teachers used to let kids go barefoot. No socks, no mats, no questions. You were expected to do laps, stretches, and sometimes full-on dodgeball games on a surface that could practically melt your toenails. The justification? It helps with grip. Or, we forgot to tell you to bring shoes. Either way, your feet took the hit. And it was not just heat. Those floors were rough, dusty, sometimes covered in tiny bits of gravel or old tape. You might leave with burns, splinters, or the dreaded mystery black smudge on your heel that stayed for days. No one handed out bandages. No one handed out warnings. Kids limped their way through jumping jacks like it was normal. Eventually, safety regulations caught up. Schools were required to keep gym floors clean, regulate temperature, and enforce appropriate footwear. No shoes, no play became the standard. Today, students need sneakers with non-marking soles and closed toes just to enter the gym. But if you grew up before those rules hit, you probably still remember that weird moment where gym class felt more like a survival test. And every time your foot hit that scalding surface, you asked yourself one thing: why is this okay? Spoiler, it was not. There was a time when school buses had more kids than seats, and the solution was just to stand. No seat belts, no adult supervision, no problem. Kids would pack into the aisles, grip the top of the nearest seat, and try to balance like it was a roller coaster. And let's be clear, bus rides were not smooth. Every bump felt like a launch pad. Every stop had you jolting forward into someone's backpack or forehead. And if the windows were open, you were dodging branches and bugs at full speed. Teachers and bus drivers rarely stepped in. They had a route to run and a schedule to keep. Standing was just part of the routine. Sometimes the driver would yell, "Sit down back there!" But there was literally nowhere to sit. Kids would turn bus rides into a weird kind of stunt show, surfing the aisle, crowding up near the driver, or even jumping between rows. And if you fell, tough luck. You learned fast. Eventually, transportation laws changed. School buses had to regulate capacity. Every student needed a seat, and standing became strictly prohibited. But if you were one of the kids packed like sardines, swaying with every turn, then you know just how intense those rides could be. The school day started with chaos, and sometimes bruises, and somehow we just called it transportation. Nothing says educational tool like handing a bunch of 12-year-olds a sharp piece of metal and saying, "Go draw circles." The classic geometry compass, you know the one, had a pencil on one side and a metal-tipped spike on the other. It was designed to puncture paper and hold steady while you drew arcs. But let's not pretend that is all it was used for. In the hands of students, these compasses became everything from poking devices to makeshift weapons. You could stab an eraser, scratch your name into a desk, pop a balloon, or, unfortunately, poke someone else just for a laugh. And let's not even get started on the kids who used them to accidentally draw on their arms. The points were sharp enough to draw blood, and somehow teachers handed them out like crayons. No warning, no safety talk, just geometry and good luck. Eventually, newer models were designed with blunted tips and protective grips. Teachers were advised to monitor usage closely, or better yet, switch to plastic or digital tools. Schools realized that handing out tiny metal daggers probably was not the safest way to teach math. But if you were there during the heyday of sharp compasses and low supervision, you remember. Drawing the perfect circle was nice. Avoiding accidental injury? That was the real achievement. You have not truly lived through old school education until you have coughed your way through a full math lesson, courtesy of a classroom-sized dust storm. Blackboards, the real ones, needed chalk, and chalk made dust, a lot of it. Every time a teacher erased the board, a gray cloud filled the air. And if they were particularly enthusiastic, that cloud stuck around for the whole day. You sat in it. You breathed it. Sometimes it even settled into your hair or clothes. There was no ventilation, no air purifiers. Windows stayed closed unless someone complained. And no one really thought about what all that dust did to your lungs. Kids with asthma had it the worst. They would cough, wheeze, or need to visit the nurse after just one class. But instead of changing the system, schools doubled down, issuing industrial chalk by the box and erasers thick enough to use as pillows. Teachers ended up with dry hands, chalk-streaked sleeves, and in some cases, breathing issues. Eventually, whiteboards replaced blackboards. Markers replaced chalk. Classrooms became cleaner, easier to maintain, and far less dusty. But if you ever walked out of math class looking like you worked in a flour mill, you remember? That haze in the air, that scratchy throat? It was not just chalk. It was the price of education, one dusty scribble at a time. There was a time when school food fights were not just tolerated. They were expected. Everyone knew the signs: a suspicious hush, a carton of milk gripped too tightly, and a wild grin from the class clown near the mashed potatoes. And then, all-out war. Chicken nuggets flew like grenades. Spaghetti was turned into a weapon. Fruit cups exploded across the room like citrus landmines. And staff? They usually stepped back until it was over. Some teachers even laughed. It was kids being kids. Some schools saw it as a quirky rite of passage, something to roll your eyes at but not stop. But food fights came with real consequences. People got hit in the face with trays, slipped on sauce, bruised by rock-solid rolls. And once video cameras became a thing, the evidence made it harder to ignore. Parents got involved. Lawsuits popped up. Health and safety policies were updated. And suddenly, a food fight was no longer funny. It was a serious offense. Today, even the threat of a food fight can get students suspended. But if you were there during the old days, elbow deep in pudding and regret, the aftermath was gross, the smell stuck around, and cafeteria workers deserved medals. It might have felt fun in the moment, but looking back, that was not mischief. That was a full-scale lunchroom disaster with extra ketchup. Now this was elite. If you had one of the early trapper keepers in the 1970s, you were operating on a different level. Forget loose folders or rubber bands. The trapper keeper was the Cadillac of school supplies. It clicked shut with that unmistakable Velcro sound, opened like a command center, and held every paper, worksheet, and secret note you owned. Some had rainbow gradients, some had race cars, others had geometric chaos that looked straight out of a disco. The binder rings snapped into place with authority. You had folders labeled for every class, and you felt like you had your life together, even if you definitely did not. Teachers both loved and hated them. Loved the organization, hated the distractions. Because, let's be honest, you spent more time decorating it with stickers and doodling hearts on the inside than actually using it. Still, there was something empowering about clicking that cover shut and slamming it on your desk. Like you were saying, yeah, I am ready to learn. Even if you just spent the whole class playing MASH in the margins. Trapper keepers were not just stationary, they were identity. They told people who you were, or at least who you wanted to be. The teacher's lounge in the 1970s had a smell you would never forget. Cigarettes, pipe smoke, maybe a hint of burnt coffee and chalk dust. That room was sacred ground for teachers, and a complete mystery to students. You would walk by and catch a whiff of something sharp in the air. They kept the door closed, but the smoke always found a way out. Inside, teachers lit up between classes, vented about students, and passed the ashtray without a second thought. It was stress relief, culture, a break in a very long day. Nobody blinked. In fact, some schools even had ashtrays built into the furniture. And when substitute teachers were especially stressed, 2 cigarettes at once was not unheard of. This was decades before we fully grasped secondhand smoke or workplace health standards. Back then, it was just adult stuff. It would take lawsuits, national campaigns, and a major shift in thinking to change things. Now, smoking is banned on almost every school property across the country, even in your car in the parking lot, for good reason. But it still shocks people who remember it. The thick clouds, the stained ceiling tiles, the way your teacher came back to class with smoke on their sweater and breath. It is not just banned now, it is unimaginable. Mixtapes were handwritten love letters wrapped in cassette cases. You waited by the radio for hours just to hit record at the perfect moment, trying to catch the start of your favorite song without the DJ talking over it. You rewound, replayed, and carefully curated the perfect order so each track melted into the next. Some were made for crushes, others for best friends. Some were sorry tapes, and some were just because. Each one had a theme, a purpose, and a heart behind it. You picked songs that said what you could not. Then you labeled the tape in your best handwriting, maybe decorated the case, and handed it over like it was treasure. Because it was. A great mixtape took hours, sometimes days, to get just right. And when someone gave you one, you listened to it until the tape wore thin and the sound warped. Mixtapes were not just music, they were memories, feelings, time capsules wrapped in magnetic ribbon. And long after the songs faded, you remembered the person who made it, their handwriting, their choices, their message. Even now, in a world of playlists, nothing hits quite like the soft click of a tape deck and a song you once recorded just for someone else. Before streaming, before boomboxes, there was the handheld AM transistor radio. It fit in your palm, had a tiny metal antenna, and brought the world to your ears one scratchy signal at a time. You turned a dial hoping for a station that came in clear. Sometimes music, sometimes baseball, sometimes late-night talk that made you feel like an adult. The static was constant, the sound was tinny, but the magic was undeniable. You could carry it anywhere. Into the backyard, under the covers, on long car rides. It was your secret channel to everything that mattered. Some had fake wood paneling. Others were neon or chrome. You might remember using a single earbud, just one, while your parents talked nearby. That little radio was a lifeline to top 40 hits, to the ball game score, to stories told in the dark, and you treated it like treasure. Batteries died fast, but you always had spares. You knew the stations by heart, and even when the sound cut out, you waited, hoping it would come back. That simple, static-filled box gave you a sense of independence. You were connected to something bigger. Even if all you got was weather and warnings, it still felt like power. Mounted on the wall like some kind of sacred artifact, the hand-crank pencil sharpener was a school day ritual. Your pencil would get dull, maybe during math, maybe in the middle of a spelling test, and you would take the long walk to the front or back of the room to sharpen it. Every eye on you. You turned the crank slowly at first, then faster. The loud grinding noise filled the whole room like a blender eating gravel. You pulled your pencil out, checked the tip, maybe cranked again. Sometimes the lead snapped right after, sometimes it came out perfect. You never really knew. There was always a little pile of shavings inside the machine. And if you were unlucky, you got the job of cleaning it out, dusty fingers and all. It was loud, it was clunky, but it worked. And there was something satisfying about it, like a small victory before diving back into your multiplication tables. That sharpener was your lifeline. A weird little break in the day. A chance to move, breathe, and reset, if only for a moment. This one still raises eyebrows, and it should. Back in the 1970s, it was not completely unheard of for teachers to date students as long as the student was legally an adult. Some schools turned a blind eye. Some communities brushed it off. They would say she is 18, they would say. He is not that much older. But let us be honest, power matters, influence matters. And a teacher dating a student, especially one in their class, blurs every line we now know is crucial. The teacher had authority, grades, reputation, access. The student had pressure, confusion, and no idea how wrong it was. Schools did not have clear policies. Administrators looked the other way. Parents sometimes even supported it. But the damage was real. Even when it felt consensual, it was not a fair playing field. Today, this is a fireable offense, a criminal investigation. Immediate headlines. Because we finally understand what was always there, an imbalance of power that no diploma can erase. For those who lived through it, it was complicated. Sometimes it felt romantic. Sometimes it felt like betrayal. Either way, it was never just a high school crush. Over-the-top hairdos in the 1980s were less about style and more about spectacle. To get that perfect towering poof or side-swept shell, you needed a can of hairspray in one hand and a teasing comb in the other. Some mornings, the bathroom turned into a construction site. Hair was sprayed, scrunched, fluffed, and frozen into place like a sculpture that dared not move. Mousse was slathered on like sunscreen, followed by heat from a curling iron so hot it could leave permanent dents in your bangs. It was a daily battle between gravity and vanity usually won. The bigger the hair, the closer to cool. Class photos from the decade show clouds of bangs, mile-high ponytails, and helmets of blonde that could survive a wind tunnel. Everyone walked around smelling faintly of aerosol. Some kids were practically flammable, but at the time, it was worth it. You judged your popularity by the size of your bangs. A flat head was social suicide. Looking back now, it seems absurd, but for those who lived it, there was no higher compliment than being told your hair looked totally rad. Before microwaves took over the world, there was Jiffy Pop. That iconic silver foil pan with the wire handle looked more like a science experiment than a snack. You placed it over the burner, turned the heat to medium, and waited. First, nothing. Then a rustle. Then a pop. Then a full-on explosion of sound as the silver dome started to rise. It puffed up like magic, growing rounder and louder until it looked like a shiny balloon about to burst. You shook the handle gently, trying not to burn the bottom. The anticipation was everything. Kids gathered around the stove like it was a campfire. Parents pretended not to worry, it might go up in flames. And then it was done. You tore open the top and reached inside, burning your fingers on the edge, of course, for a handful of hot, buttery popcorn. It did not matter if half of it was burnt and the other half still kernels. It was the experience, the ritual. The popcorn was secondary. The fun was in the show. Jiffy Pop was not just a snack. It was a performance. And if you ever had a movie night that started with that sizzling silver pan, you remember the thrill of the balloon. Ice cubes were once a challenge, not a luxury. If you grew up with metal ice cube trays, you knew there was something electric in the air when your teacher wheeled in the classroom radio and said, "We're listening to a NASA broadcast today." Everything stopped. No math, no spelling, no worksheets, just ears perked and eyes wide, waiting for voices from space. In the 1970s, this was the closest thing we had to live streaming history. You would hear that scratchy, tinny hum come through the radio speaker, and then the voice of Mission Control or a real astronaut talking from orbit. The room fell quiet. You could hear chairs creak and kids shift, but nobody dared speak. This was bigger than your classroom, bigger than the school. It felt like America itself had paused, just so you could listen. You might not have understood everything they said about telemetry or orbit velocity, but it did not matter. You were part of it. When someone said liftoff, you imagined it. You saw the rockets in your mind. And afterward, you all talked about it like you had been there. It made you dream bigger, made you want to be an astronaut, or at least someone who mattered. That radio, with its plastic knobs and metal antenna, brought space right into the room, and for a few minutes, you were floating with them. Some teachers in the 1970s used nicknames they thought were playful or harmless, but let us call it what it was: racism in plain sight. Kids were called things based on their skin color, accent, or background. A Spanish-speaking student might be called Speedy, an Asian student Ping Pong. Black students got the worst of it, often being reduced to stereotypes right in the middle of class. Teachers made jokes, used slurs casually, said things that would get you canceled in 10 seconds flat today. But back then, no one said much. Even when kids complained, they were told to toughen up. The teacher did not mean it. It was just a joke. But these jokes left scars. They made kids feel small, like outsiders, like they were only ever going to be what the teacher decided to call them. Today, we understand the deep harm this caused. Every school now has anti-discrimination policies, diversity training, reporting procedures. But that does not erase what happened. That does not erase the kids who sat through class every day with a fake name, a forced smile, and a sinking feeling that no one really saw them, and that maybe they never would. VHS rental adventures were more than just picking a movie. They were the night's main event. You walked into the store greeted by rows of clamshell cases, each one shouting for your attention with over-the-top artwork and dramatic taglines. New releases lined the front wall, but they were often already rented, marked by empty plastic holders and your own growing disappointment. So you wandered. Comedy? Horror? Something animated for your little brother? You judged movies by their cover. You flipped tapes to read the backs, squinted at blurry screenshots, and made last-minute switches at checkout. There was pressure. Choose wisely. You had this movie for 2 nights, maybe 3. Forget to rewind? Expect a fee. Some stores even had a "Be Kind Rewind" sign that became a national motto. You got home, made popcorn, and watched together as a family. The sound of the tape sliding into the VCR meant it was officially movie night. VHS rentals turned average evenings into little adventures. They made choosing a movie feel like a quest. And even though we stream everything now, nothing beats the charm of browsing those old shelves and hoping your top pick had not been snatched first. Suddenly turned red, white, and blue. The United States Bicentennial was not just a celebration, it was a full-on marketing explosion. You could not walk through a store without seeing patriotic plates, mugs, coins, or even shampoo bottles branded with stars and stripes. It was not just about pride, it was about collecting. From quarters stamped with a drummer boy to commemorative soda cans and decorative tins, Americans scooped up anything that screamed 1776 to 1976. Kids got coloring books with bald eagles. Adults hung commemorative plates on the wall and bought matching sets of Liberty Bell glasses from the gas station. You might remember paperweights, lunchboxes, and even cereal boxes that joined in. For one shining year, everything in your house looked like it belonged to George Washington's birthday party. And while some saw it as kitschy or overdone, others cherished these pieces. They were physical reminders of a once-in-a-lifetime celebration. Even today, if you find one buried in a drawer or tucked in a box, it hits differently. Not just patriotic, but personal. Because in that moment, the whole country was decorating its memory, and every family had at least one artifact to prove they were part of it. Every classroom had one. That long strip of letters running above the chalkboard showing the perfect way to write in cursive. Capital A to lowercase z with loops, tails, and curves so smooth they looked like art. In the 1970s, cursive was serious business. You practiced it every day, filled entire notebooks with drills, and had to learn how to connect letters like it was a secret code. Teachers would walk down the aisles checking your loops, making sure your capital Q did not look like a number 2. And let us not even talk about how brutal lowercase z was. That chart above the board stared you down every class, like, yes, I am elegant. You, try harder. It was both inspiration and pressure. You tried to copy those curves exactly. Maybe you got close. Maybe your handwriting looked like spaghetti. Either way, cursive class was its own kind of rite of passage. Everyone had a different style, but the goal was always the same. Write like a grown-up. Write like someone who meant business. And even if you forgot how to do it today, you still remember the feel of your pencil dragging across the page in slow, careful loops. It is hard to believe, but there was a time when embarrassing students on purpose was part of the job. If you forgot your homework, gave the wrong answer, or acted up in class, you might be handed the dunce cap, a pointed paper hat with your mistake on full display. Some teachers would make you stand in the corner, back to the class. Others would label you with signs: lazy, chatterbox, class clown. There were even instances where kids were forced to write lines on the chalkboard again and again until their fingers cramped. This was not rare. It was routine. Teachers believed shame was a shortcut to obedience. It was public correction meant to serve as an example. But instead of learning, kids just learned how to hide. They learned that mistakes were dangerous, that being seen meant being punished. Decades later, the psychological damage is undeniable. Public humiliation in a classroom strips away dignity, reinforces fear, and teaches silence. Today, anything close to this would get a teacher fired. Immediate suspension, lawsuits, mental health evaluations. Now we understand that kids need safety to grow, not shame. But for those who stood at the front of the room in that ridiculous cone hat, hearing giggles and whispers from classmates, it still stings. The joke never ends when you are the punchline. Television Guide was the original streaming schedule, printed, folded, and worshipped. Each week, families flipped through its pages to plan their entire viewing life. What time is your show on? What channel is the big movie airing? Without a television guide, you were lost in the static. It listed every program, from early morning cartoons to late-night reruns. You circled shows in pen. You memorized time slots. You argued with siblings over what to watch and when. Sometimes you even set a timer on the VCR to record your favorites, if you could figure out how. Television Guide came with featured articles, behind-the-scenes trivia, and occasionally a glossy cover that made you feel like you were holding something special. It was not just a magazine, it was a map, a lifeline, and a reminder that missing your show meant waiting until summer reruns or, gasp, never seeing it again. Kids today will never understand the pressure of being ready at exactly 7 o'clock, or the heartbreak of flipping the page and realizing your favorite show was preempted by a holiday parade. The television guide was small, simple, and essential, and in a world before scrolling, it helped us find our way through the glow of the living room screen. It was wrapped in thick, crinkly plastic, not soft, not breathable, just clear, sticky protection against the sins of children, pets, and snack time. You would sit down and instantly stick. Every move made a noise. In summer, it was a trap. In winter, it was a slide. But that plastic was sacred. It kept the real fabric safe. Underneath was often a scratchy floral print, untouched for years. No one knew what it felt like, because the covers never came off. Guests, family, even pets were expected to obey the rule. Plastic only. It was like sitting on a giant sheet of packing tape. Every fart noise was unintentional, every moment slightly uncomfortable. But the goal was clear: preserve the couch forever. And it kind of worked. Some of those covered sofas are still around, still spotless under their shiny armor. Looking back, it seems excessive, hilarious even. But in a time when furniture was an investment and messes were constant, plastic covers made sense. Strange sense, but sense all the same. They were a part of the home, for better or stickier. In 1976, the overhead projector was the crown jewel of classroom technology in the 1970s. It looked like a weird lamp from the future, but when the teacher rolled it in, you knew things were about to get serious. The clear transparency sheets, sometimes handwritten, sometimes printed, would be carefully laid on the glass. The light would shine up through it, reflect off the angled mirror, and bam, the wall turned into a giant worksheet. Teachers would use dry erase markers to underline, circle, and emphasize things like they were news anchors on live television. Sometimes they wrote too fast, sometimes they forgot to erase, and every once in a while, they'd block the light with their hand and accidentally cast a giant shadow that looked like a puppet show across the whiteboard. You always paid closer attention when the overhead came out, not because it was more interesting, but because it felt more official, like you were about to be hit with a pop quiz or a grammar rule that would follow you for the rest of your life. You could see the handwriting projected huge, right on the board. It was hard to ignore, hard to escape, but somehow you still kind of loved it. It sounds wild to say out loud now, but back then, teachers could physically handle you in ways that would cause an uproar today. Getting your arm yanked hard enough to spin you around was just another Tuesday. Slaps on the hand, the back of the head, or even a sharp flick to the ear? That was classroom management in the 1970s. You were not sent out. You were grabbed, tugged by the collar, sat back down with force. These were not teachers flying off the handle. This was how they were trained. Respect came from control, and control came from keeping order by any means necessary. Schools viewed discipline as physical correction. Parents rarely pushed back. If anything, they told teachers to do what you need to do. What no one talked about was how it felt to be treated like that as a kid. The fear, the embarrassment, the way it told you that adults did not have to listen or explain. They just had to act. Today, any of that, grabbing, pushing, physical corrections, would lead to an instant investigation. And rightly so. We finally started seeing kids as people, not just problems to fix. There is still debate today about old-school discipline, but one thing is clear. Fear-based control has no place in a modern classroom. And if you flinch when someone raises a hand, you are not imagining it. Some things stay with you. Atari gaming sessions were pixelated magic. You plugged in a cartridge, gripped a joystick, and entered a world made of blinking squares and bleeping sounds. The graphics were basic, the controls were stiff, and yet you were hooked. Pong, Frogger, Space Invaders. Each game was a challenge, a test of reflexes and patience. You played alone, with friends, or against your sibling for hours. The television hummed, the screen flickered. The joystick squeaked under the weight of your determination. Games froze, scores reset. But the fun never stopped. Atari brought the arcade home, turning dens and basements into battlegrounds of bragging rights. There were no saves, no checkpoints, just you and your ability to last longer than your last game. Every win felt epic. Every loss felt personal. And if the cartridge did not load, you took it out, blew into it like a sacred ritual, and tried again. Atari gaming was simple, frustrating, and unforgettable. It was not about the graphics. It was about the experience. And for those who held that joystick and battled blinking enemies, those early games are etched in memory. Proof that sometimes a bouncing square was all it took to feel like a hero. The big wheel tricycle was not quiet. It was not smooth. It did not have gears or brakes or padding, but in the 1970s, it was everything. Made of hard plastic, it sat low to the ground with a giant front wheel and two tiny ones in back. It made you feel fast, cool, and slightly invincible. The handlebars squeaked. The wheels clicked. Every turn was a drift. Every ride was a race. You could spin out on the sidewalk like a stunt driver. You could chase your friends down the block, legs pumping wildly, plastic wheels screaming in protest. The seat usually wobbled. The stickers peeled off after a week. But none of that mattered. The big wheel was freedom. It did not look like a tricycle. It looked like something better, sleeker, edgier. You did not just ride it. You rode into battle, or the corner store, or the backyard dirt track you called the racetrack. It scuffed your shoes. It burned holes in your knees. But you loved it. There was something about sitting that low, hearing the thunder of your wheels and feeling like you could outrun the whole neighborhood. For a generation of kids, it was not just a toy, it was a throne. Getting one of these was like winning the lottery. Funky reward stickers in the 1970s were bright, goofy, and smelled like synthetic heaven. Scratch and sniff? That was next level. Your teacher would slap one on your paper if you nailed a quiz or finally stopped talking during spelling. Gold stars, smiley faces, anthropomorphic apples giving thumbs up. Whatever the design, it meant you were seen. You did something right. Sometimes you would stick them on your desk, or your trapper keeper, or just keep them in a little sticker album, waiting for the perfect spot. You might even trade them like baseball cards during recess. Some kids collected them obsessively, comparing who had which scents or the rare holographic ones that shimmered under fluorescent lights. Teachers kept them in a little drawer like treasure. You knew the rules. Do your work, stay quiet, sticker earned. But deep down, it was never about behavior. It was about pride. That moment when a tiny square of shiny adhesive told you, hey, you did good. No trophy, no medal, just a sticker, and it was everything. In the 1970s, dress codes were not just rules, they were declarations. Boys could not have long hair. Girls had to wear skirts. Slacks on a girl? That was a trip to the principal's office. Earrings on a boy? That was a reason for detention. These codes were everywhere, on paper, on posters, on the lips of teachers who called out anyone who looked different. It was not just about clothes. It was about control, a way to force kids to fit neatly into boxes, no matter how uncomfortable. And if you stepped outside the line, you were seen as trouble. And the worst part? They were enforced with pride. Schools claimed they were protecting tradition, but really, they were reinforcing a narrow idea of who people should be. Individuality was not welcome. Gender expression was policed. Kids were forced to conform or be punished. Today, this would be seen as blatant discrimination. Most schools now allow students to dress in ways that reflect who they are, not just what the school wants them to be. But for those who were told to act like a lady or man up, the lesson stuck. That fitting in meant hiding, and that who you were was always going to be second to how you looked. If one of these banned school throwbacks made you laugh, wince, or whisper, "We really did that," drop your wildest memory in the comments. Give this video a like it just nailed the morning announcements, and hit subscribe so you never miss a hall pass to the past.